It was a brisk autumn morning, and the sun's golden rays gently filtered through the large windows of Mercy Hill Hospital. The small town of Brookfield was still waking up, its quiet streets dotted with early risers heading to work or school. Inside the hospital, the day had already begun with the usual hum of activity. The hospital was modest in size, but it was the heart of the town. Many of its staff had worked there for years, including Nurse Clara. Clara had always been a constant at the hospital. She'd grown up in Brookfield, and after training to be a nurse, she returned to serve her community. Her reputation as a kind, skilled, and efficient nurse had earned her the respect and trust of everyone: patients, colleagues, and even doctors. She had a natural grace, always knowing how to comfort anxious patients or smooth over tense situations. But today, something felt off. The arrival of a new doctor, Dr. Mitchell, had stirred things up. He was from the city, a place where people seemed to live life a little faster, a little colder. Clara had barely interacted with him so far, but his reputation preceded him. The other nurses whispered about his condescending attitude, his arrogance, and his lack of warmth. Clara, ever professional, kept her judgments to herself, though she felt a quiet tension in the air. By mid-morning, Clara was doing her usual rounds when Dr. Mitchell stormed into the ward. His footsteps were heavy, and the air seemed to thicken with his presence. He was visibly agitated, barking orders at the staff, and flipping through patient charts without so much as a glance at the nurses who handed them to him. Clara, busy with a patient in one of the rooms, didn't notice him until she stepped out into the hallway. It was at that moment that she came face to face with Dr. Mitchell, who stood beside an elderly patient, Mr. Carter, in a small examination room. Mr. Carter, a frail man in his late 70s, sat quietly in a hospital gown, his hands folded in his lap. He had a serene, almost dignified air about him, though there was nothing about him that screamed wealth or status. He was just another patient in a long line of patients for the day. "Excuse me, nurse," Dr. Mitchell snapped, turning to Clara with a stern look. His voice cut through the air like ice. "I've been waiting for these charts. Why are you standing around?" Clara was caught off guard. She had been meticulously managing her workload all morning and had always prided herself on being prompt and efficient. She immediately stepped forward to hand him the charts, her professionalism intact despite his rude tone. "I apologize, Doctor. Here are the charts you requested," Clara said, her voice steady, though she felt the sting of his unwarranted criticism. Dr. Mitchell snatched the charts from her hand and, without looking up, said loudly, "I don't need apologies. I need competency. You might get away with being slow in a small-town hospital, but where I come from, this would be unacceptable." Clara felt a wave of embarrassment flood her face. A few nurses and staff in the hallway glanced over, their faces a mix of sympathy and shock. Clara was not accustomed to being humiliated in front of colleagues, and certainly not in front of a patient. Mr. Carter, sitting in the examination room, quietly watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, the room seemed frozen. Clara stood there, unsure of what to say. Normally, she could handle difficult doctors or patients, but the public nature of this reprimand made it sting more than usual. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, but what stunned more was Mr. Carter's silence. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second. There was no judgment or pity, only a calm, steady gaze. He said nothing, and neither did Clara. Dr. Mitchell didn't wait for a response. He turned back to Mr. Carter, continuing the examination as though nothing had happened. Clara felt a strange sensation in the pit of her stomach as she excused herself from the room, her heart pounding. Something about Mr. Carter's demeanor felt different, like he knew something everyone else didn't. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the incident lingered in Clara's mind. She felt unsettled, not just by Dr. Mitchell's behavior, but by the quiet reaction of Mr. Carter. He had sat there, motionless, watching the scene unfold, yet something in his eyes hinted at a deeper understanding, an unspoken power. As the day came to an end, Clara was wrapping up her shift at the nurse's station when the head nurse, Susan, approached her with a look of concern. "Clara, can I talk to you for a moment?" Susan asked, her voice gentle but serious. Clara nodded, still feeling the weight of the earlier incident hanging over her. Susan led her into a small break room where they could speak in private. "I heard what happened with Dr. Mitchell earlier," Susan began, her brow furrowed. "You know, most of us would have handled that situation the same way you did. But there's something you need to know about Mr. Carter." Clara looked at her, confused. "Mr. Carter? What about him?" "He didn't seem upset by what happened. He barely reacted." Susan leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "That's because Mr. Carter isn't just any patient. He's one of the most influential figures in Brookfield. He's been quietly behind many of the hospital's major decisions for years. He's old money. His family helped build this town, but he's always stayed in the background, keeping a low profile." Clara's eyes widened in shock. She had no idea. Mr. Carter had seemed so ordinary, so humble. But now, knowing who he really was, she realized that his silence during the incident with Dr. Mitchell wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he was carefully observing. "He may not say much," Susan continued, "but trust me, Mr. Carter sees everything. And he has the power to change things around here, for better or worse." Clara sat back, stunned. The quiet, unassuming patient she had seen that morning wasn't just any elderly man. He was a hidden figure of power, someone who could shift the very foundation of the hospital and the town. She realized in that moment that the humiliation she'd experienced wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Clara Dawson had always been a pillar of Brookfield, the small town she called home. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to provide for her, Clara learned the values of hard work, empathy, and resilience from an early age. These values shaped her decision to pursue nursing, a profession where she could not only make a living, but also give back to the community that had supported her. Brookfield was a quiet, close-knit town where everyone knew everyone's name. Clara had grown up surrounded by people who looked out for each other, and as she transitioned from being a student to a full-fledged nurse at Mercy Hill Hospital, she carried that sense of connection into her work. The people she cared for weren't just patients. They were neighbors, friends, and sometimes even the same people who had watched her grow up. From the start, Clara approached nursing with an open heart. She didn't see her patients as cases to be solved or tasks to be completed. She saw them as individuals with stories, struggles, and needs. Her coworkers admired her not only for her technical skills, but for her warmth, which was as much a part of her healing touch as any medication she administered. Clara had a way of making each patient feel like they were her priority, whether it was holding the hand of a nervous mother-to-be during labor or sitting with an elderly patient through the lonely hours of a long hospital stay. Her dedication went far beyond the walls of the hospital. Clara was known to drop by patients' homes after her shifts to check on them, especially if they had no family nearby. She organized community health fairs, arranged free screenings for the elderly, and often volunteered at the local food pantry. Clara's life was a reflection of the community values she held dear: compassion, service, and integrity. In her personal life, Clara lived in a modest home just a few blocks from the hospital. She was unmarried and had no children, but she didn't mind. Her job was fulfilling enough, and the connection she had with her patients and colleagues filled her life with meaning. She wasn't just a nurse. She was Brookfield's caregiver, always willing to go the extra mile. Then came Dr. Mitchell. Dr. David Mitchell was everything Clara wasn't. Recently transferred from a prestigious hospital in the city, he arrived at Mercy Hill with an air of superiority that set him apart from the rest of the staff. Where Clara embodied warmth and humility, Dr. Mitchell radiated detachment and arrogance. Tall and impeccably dressed, he moved through the hospital as though it were beneath him, a small stepping stone on his way to greater things. Brookfield's charm was lost on him. He didn't understand why the people here moved slower, why they lingered for conversations, or why patients seemed to expect something more than just medical treatment. To him, medicine was a science, a series of problems to be diagnosed and solved. He had no patience for small-town pleasantries, and he certainly had no time for the nonsense of building personal relationships with patients. His first few weeks at Mercy Hill were rocky, to say the least. Nurses bristled under his cold, dismissive attitude, and patients were left feeling like little more than numbers on a chart. Dr. Mitchell saw no reason to change his ways. In his mind, he was the best doctor at the hospital, and it was the rest of them who needed to catch up. He had seen it all in the city: high-pressure emergency rooms, cutting-edge procedures, and the fast-paced world of urban medicine. What did a small-town hospital have to offer him? Still, his medical skills were undeniable. He was a talented physician with a sharp intellect, and there was no question that he knew his stuff. But where Clara thrived on connection, Dr. Mitchell thrived on efficiency. He preferred quick, decisive action to the slower, more patient-centered care that Mercy Hill's staff had cultivated. He rarely took time to explain things to his patients, and he found their questions tiresome. His relationship with the hospital staff grew strained almost immediately. Clara, who usually got along with everyone, found it hard to connect with him. His cold demeanor and lack of respect for the team rubbed her the wrong way, but she remained professional. She believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, and she hoped that over time, Dr. Mitchell might soften. But with each passing day, it became clear that he wasn't interested in fitting in. He was interested in proving himself superior. In stark contrast to Dr. Mitchell's outward arrogance was the quiet, unassuming presence of Mr. Lawrence Carter. Mr. Carter was a longtime resident of Brookfield, though few people really knew much about him. To most, he was just an elderly man who occasionally came into the hospital for routine checkups, someone who kept to himself and never sought attention. But those who took the time to dig a little deeper knew that Mr. Carter was far from ordinary. Behind his humble appearance was a man of significant influence. Decades ago, Mr. Carter's family had played a key role in the development of Brookfield. His father had been a wealthy industrialist who quietly funded many of the town's major projects, from the construction of Mercy Hill Hospital to the development of the local library and several parks. The Carter family had always been known for their philanthropy, but they did it in a way that kept them out of the spotlight. Mr. Carter had inherited not only his family's wealth, but also their deep ties to Brookfield's infrastructure. Though he never flaunted his power, he still had a hand in many of the town's most important decisions. He served as a silent benefactor, ensuring that the hospital received the funding it needed and that certain programs continued to run smoothly. What made him truly unique was that he never sought recognition. Most people in town didn't even realize how much of their everyday life had been quietly influenced by him. Clara had always admired Mr. Carter. Though they had never had a personal conversation beyond the usual pleasantries exchanged during his hospital visits, she respected him. He seemed to carry himself with a quiet dignity, a sharp contrast to Dr. Mitchell's brash arrogance. Mr. Carter didn't need to command attention to assert his influence. He was the kind of man who could shape the world around him with a single conversation behind closed doors. What made Mr. Carter even more enigmatic was that he never used his influence for personal gain. Everything he did was for the betterment of Brookfield. It wasn't about money or power for him. It was about preserving the community his family had helped build. And though he rarely made waves, those who crossed him found that he wasn't someone to be underestimated. This hidden power was something Dr. Mitchell had no idea about. To him, Mr. Carter was just another old man in the hospital, no more important than the dozens of other patients he saw every day. But Clara had seen enough to know that Mr. Carter's silence was never a sign of weakness. He was always watching, always observing, and when the time came for him to act, he would do so in a way that no one saw coming. As Clara reflected on the earlier incident with Dr. Mitchell, she couldn't help but wonder what Mr. Carter had thought. He had sat there quietly as Dr. Mitchell berated her, not saying a word. But something about the way his eyes had followed the doctor told her that this was far from over. Clara had a sense that Mr. Carter's quiet presence was more powerful than anyone realized, and she had a feeling that Dr. Mitchell was about to find that out in a way he wouldn't forget. The stage was set. Clara's dedication, Dr. Mitchell's arrogance, and Mr. Carter's hidden influence were about to collide in a way that would change everything. And though none of them knew it yet, the events of the coming days would reveal truths about power, respect, and the strength of a community that could not be ignored. The days following the incident with Dr. Mitchell were anything but normal for Clara. She tried to go about her duties as usual, attending to her patients with the same warmth and dedication that had always defined her. But something had shifted within her, and the weight of her public humiliation in front of Mr. Carter lingered heavily in her mind. Clara had always prided herself on being calm and composed, but this was different. The stain of Dr. Mitchell's condescending words, spoken loudly in front of a man she now knew to be one of Brookfield's most powerful figures, gnawed at her. As she sat at the nurse's station during a brief break, Clara replayed the moment over and over in her head. Should she have stood up for herself? Should she have called out Dr. Mitchell's arrogance right there in the examination room? Or had she done the right thing by maintaining her professionalism and choosing silence? Her thoughts were interrupted by a tap on her shoulder. It was Susan, the head nurse, and her friend. "Are you okay, Clara? You've been a bit distant since the other day," Susan said, her voice gentle but concerned. Clara sighed, looking down at her hands. "I don't know, Susan. Part of me thinks I should have confronted him. But what good would that have done? He's the doctor, and I'm just the nurse. If I had spoken up, he might have turned it into something even worse." Susan placed a reassuring hand on Clara's arm. "You're more than just a nurse. Everyone knows how valuable you are here, Clara. And if Dr. Mitchell can't see that, well, that's his problem." Clara smiled weakly, grateful for Susan's support, but it didn't ease the doubt gnawing at her. As much as she tried to push it aside, the humiliation had left a mark. The real question was, what was she supposed to do about it? Was it worth confronting Dr. Mitchell now, after the fact? Or would that only escalate things further? As the days passed, it became clear that the incident wasn't going to remain a private matter. Small towns like Brookfield had a way of making every small event ripple through the community. Though Clara hadn't said a word to anyone outside the hospital about what had happened, whispers began to circulate. The nurses who had witnessed the scene couldn't help but share what they had seen with their friends and families. Soon, the story of Dr. Mitchell's public belittling of Clara had spread throughout Brookfield. Some in the community were quick to rally behind Clara, outraged that one of their own had been treated so poorly by an outsider. At the grocery store, one of Clara's patients, Mrs. Long, stopped her to offer support. "I heard what that new doctor did to you, Clara," Mrs. Long said, her eyes flashing with indignation. "You've been nothing but a blessing to this town, and we won't stand for anyone disrespecting you like that." Others, however, were more cautious, unwilling to take sides. Dr. Mitchell, after all, was still a doctor, an important figure in the hospital, and no one wanted to be seen as disrespecting him. For some, his arrogance was excused as part of the package that came with being a big city doctor. He knew more, they reasoned, and perhaps his attitude was just a reflection of the high standards he was used to. Clara could feel the growing divide. Some patients gave her sympathetic looks, while others seemed to avoid eye contact, as if they didn't want to get involved. The tension in the hospital was palpable as well. Her fellow nurses were clearly on her side, but they had to tread carefully around Dr. Mitchell. The doctors, on the other hand, remained distant, either unaware of the brewing storm or choosing not to acknowledge it. Clara felt like she was walking on eggshells. The unspoken tension was suffocating, and every interaction with Dr. Mitchell felt like a new battle waiting to happen. He hadn't addressed the incident, but his dismissive attitude persisted, making Clara's workdays more difficult. It was as if the air itself crackled with unspoken conflict, and everyone was just waiting for something to tip the balance. Unbeknownst to Dr. Mitchell, The quiet storm he had set in motion was growing stronger each day. In his mind, the incident with Clara was a non-issue. To him, she was just another nurse, someone whose feelings were irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. His focus was on his work, on being the best doctor in the hospital, and proving that he was far more competent than the small-town staff he found himself surrounded by. Dr. Mitchell continued his rounds with the same aloof detachment, barking orders at the nurses and treating them as though they were little more than assistants in his personal quest for medical excellence. He didn't realize that his behavior was not only alienating the staff, but also slowly eroding the respect the town had for him. In Brookfield, personal relationships mattered, and Dr. Mitchell was quickly building a reputation as someone who didn't care about anything but himself. One afternoon, as Clara was reviewing a patient's chart, Dr. Mitchell approached her without so much as a greeting. "Nurse Dawson," he said curtly, "I need the patient records from the last week in room 203. And please, this time, try to be more efficient." His words stung, but Clara bit her tongue, her professional demeanor intact. She handed him the records without saying a word, but inside, her frustration was building. How long could she keep pretending that this didn't bother her? That evening, after a particularly long and draining shift, Clara returned home. The house was quiet, and for the first time all day, she allowed herself to exhale fully. The weight of everything, the incident, the whispers in the town, Dr. Mitchell's continued mistreatment, felt heavier in the solitude of her living room. She sat down on her couch, sinking into the familiar comfort of her surroundings, but her mind continued to race. As she was preparing to settle down for the night, her phone rang. Clara glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for a regular call. She didn't recognize the number. And for a moment, she hesitated. Something told her this call wasn't ordinary. "Hello," she answered, her voice tentative. "Is this Nurse Clara Dawson?" The voice on the other end was low, almost cautious. "Yes, this is Clara." "Who's calling?" she replied, her pulse quickening. The voice paused for a moment before continuing. "I can't tell you who I am, but I know about the incident with Dr. Mitchell." Clara sat up straighter, her heart now pounding. "What do you mean?" "I can't go into details over the phone," the voice continued, "but you need to know that Mr. Carter hasn't forgotten what happened. He's not a man who lets things like this go. Things are already in motion." Clara's mouth went dry. "What are you talking about? What's in motion?" "All I can say is that Mr. Carter has more influence than most people realize. Dr. Mitchell doesn't understand who he humiliated, but he's about to find out." The line went dead. Clara sat there, her mind racing. The call left her with more questions than answers. Who had called her, and why? What did they mean by "things are in motion"? And more importantly, what was Mr. Carter planning? The mysterious call was both unsettling and strangely reassuring. It confirmed what Clara had suspected. Mr. Carter hadn't just sat there passively during the incident with Dr. Mitchell. He had been observing, and now something was about to happen. But what? And how would it affect her, Dr. Mitchell, and the entire hospital? Clara didn't know, but one thing was clear. The situation was far from over, and whatever was coming next would change everything. It had been a few weeks since the mysterious phone call, and Clara's life had settled into a cautious routine. Though she was still haunted by the tension with Dr. Mitchell, she pushed through her shifts, doing her best to avoid direct confrontation with him. The undercurrent of unresolved conflict lingered in the air, and the hospital staff whispered more than ever about the brewing storm. But no one, including Clara, knew exactly what was coming. That is, until Mr. Carter reappeared. It was a cold, crisp morning when Mr. Lawrence Carter returned to Mercy Hill Hospital for his follow-up appointment. Clara hadn't been notified of his visit, but as soon as she saw his name on the patient list, a sense of foreboding washed over her. This time, Mr. Carter wasn't alone. Walking beside him were several prominent figures from the town. The mayor, the local councilman, the head of the town's largest business association, and even the chief of the hospital's board. Their presence was unmistakable, and as they moved through the hospital hallways, heads turned, whispers followed. Clara watched from the nurse's station as Mr. Carter, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, greeted everyone with his usual calm and composed demeanor. But there was something different in his eyes today, a quiet intensity that she hadn't seen before. This was no ordinary follow-up visit. As Mr. Carter and his entourage made their way to the hospital boardroom, Clara's pulse quickened. She had an unsettling feeling that the events of the day would bring everything to a head. It wasn't long before the call came for her to join the meeting. When Clara entered the boardroom, she was greeted by the sight of Mr. Carter sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by the town's leaders. Across from him sat Dr. Mitchell, who was visibly confused, though his arrogance still showed in his stiff posture. The hospital board members, usually relaxed and jovial, were quiet, their faces tense, as they awaited what was clearly going to be a confrontation. The air in the room was heavy with anticipation. Clara could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and she fought to maintain her composure as she sat down in one of the chairs near the back of the room. She wasn't sure why she had been called in, but deep down, she had a sense that Mr. Carter's return was about far more than just a routine checkup. Mr. Carter cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. He didn't speak loudly, but his words carried a weight that made everyone in the room sit up and pay attention. "Thank you all for coming today," Mr. Carter began, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Dr. Mitchell. "I requested this meeting because there is an issue at Mercy Hill Hospital that must be addressed, one that goes beyond medical procedures and day-to-day operations. It's about respect, decency, and the way we treat the people who keep this institution running." Dr. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unsure of what was happening. His confusion deepened as Mr. Carter's gaze hardened. "Dr. Mitchell," Mr. Carter continued, "you may not know this, but I've been a part of this town for many decades. My family helped build this hospital, and I have quietly supported its operations for years. I don't seek recognition or attention for what I do, because my concern has always been for the well-being of this community. But I am not here today to speak about myself. I am here to address something far more important, the treatment of the people who work tirelessly to make this hospital what it is." The room was deathly silent. Dr. Mitchell's jaw clenched, his face pale as he began to realize that this meeting was not in his favor. "I was a patient here a few weeks ago," Mr. Carter said, his voice growing sharper. "And during my time in this hospital, I witnessed behavior that was not only unprofessional, but also deeply troubling. A behavior that came from you, Dr. Mitchell." Dr. Mitchell's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to respond, but Mr. Carter raised a hand to stop him. "I sat in that examination room as you humiliated one of the finest nurses this hospital has ever had," Mr. Carter continued, his voice now filled with barely contained anger. "Nurse Clara Dawson, who has served this community with kindness, respect, and unwavering dedication. You spoke to her as though she were beneath you, belittling her in front of me, a patient. And you did so without an ounce of remorse." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Hearing Mr. Carter speak up for her in such a public and powerful way sent a wave of emotion through her. She had never expected this, a man of his status defending her so fiercely in front of the hospital's leaders. Dr. Mitchell's composure was crumbling. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly flustered by the sudden spotlight being placed on his actions. But Mr. Carter wasn't finished. "This hospital was built on the foundation of community," Mr. Carter said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "And in this community, we value every single person, from the doctors to the nurses, to the janitorial staff. No one here is more important than anyone else. Your behavior, Dr. Mitchell, is not only unacceptable, but it also goes against the very values that Mercy Hill stands for." The hospital board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. Dr. Mitchell, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. His arrogance had finally caught up with him. "And now, in front of the most powerful people in town, his behavior was being laid bare for all to see. In light of your treatment of Nurse Dawson and your continued disregard for the values of this institution, Mr. Carter said, his voice cold and resolute, I am recommending that the hospital board review your position here at Mercy Hill. It's time for this hospital to decide whether we will allow someone who disrespects their colleagues to continue working here. The room was silent. Dr. Mitchell's face was a mix of anger and disbelief. He had come to this town thinking he was untouchable, but now the rug had been pulled out from under him. He was finally facing the consequences of his arrogance. As the gravity of the situation settled over the room, all eyes turned to Clara. The hospital board was waiting for her to speak, and it was clear that her opinion held great weight in the decision that was about to be made. Clara could feel the pressure mounting. She knew that she had the power to make or break Dr. Mitchell's career in Brookfield. All it would take was a single word from her, and he could be gone for good. The temptation to retaliate was strong. After everything he had put her through, the public humiliation, the constant belittling, the arrogance that had made her daily work a nightmare, Clara had every reason to want to see him gone. She could end it all right here, in this moment. But as she looked at Dr. Mitchell, slouched in his chair and clearly defeated, Clara felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Yes, he had been cruel and arrogant, but was vengeance really the answer? Would taking him down in front of everyone truly make her feel better? Or would it only drag her down to his level? The room was waiting for her decision. Clara took a deep breath and spoke, her voice calm but firm. Dr. Mitchell's behavior was wrong, and I won't pretend that it didn't hurt me. But I believe that everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. If Dr. Mitchell is willing to reflect on his actions and make amends, I don't want to see him lose his position here. Mercy Hill is a place for healing, and I believe in giving people the opportunity to grow. The room was silent as Clara's words sank in. Mr. Carter nodded slowly, a look of respect in his eyes. Dr. Mitchell, clearly humbled, looked down at the table, unable to meet her gaze. Clara had chosen the high road. She had chosen compassion over revenge. And in that moment, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The decision wasn't easy, but it was the right one. As the meeting concluded, Clara realized that this wasn't just about her and Dr. Mitchell. It was about the kind of person she wanted to be, and the kind of community she wanted to help build. In the end, she had chosen to lead by example, showing everyone that true strength lies not in retaliation, but in grace. The aftermath of the showdown between Mr. Carter and Dr. Mitchell reverberated through every corner of Brookfield. News of the incident spread quickly, and within days, the story had taken on a life of its own. At the local diner, in the grocery store, and even during Sunday church services, the people of the town whispered about how the arrogant city doctor had been publicly reprimanded by one of Brookfield's most powerful figures. Dr. Mitchell's treatment of Clara became the focal point of every conversation. For Dr. Mitchell, the fallout was swift and brutal. He had walked into Brookfield with his head held high, confident that his credentials and big city experience would make him untouchable. Now that same arrogance had become his undoing. Word of his mistreatment of Clara reached not only the hospital staff, but also the broader community, and it wasn't long before patients began requesting to see other doctors. Some even canceled their appointments with him outright, unwilling to be treated by someone they now saw as untrustworthy. The hospital board, prompted by Mr. Carter's public denouncement, opened an official review of Dr. Mitchell's behavior. Though the board had initially welcomed him as a prestigious addition to the hospital, they now had to face the reality that his attitude had done significant damage to the hospital's reputation. For weeks, the board deliberated over whether to let Dr. Mitchell go. His clinical skills were undeniable, but his interpersonal conduct was deemed unacceptable for a place like Mercy Hill, where relationships mattered as much as medical expertise. Meanwhile, Dr. Mitchell tried to maintain his usual air of superiority, but it was clear that he was no longer in control. His colleagues avoided him. The nurses walked on eggshells around him, and even the hospital administrators began treating him with a cold formality. His once confident stride had become more hesitant, as though he was aware that every step he took could be his last at Mercy Hill. While Dr. Mitchell's reputation crumbled, Clara's soared to new heights. The town of Brookfield rallied behind her in a way she had never expected. People she had known for years, along with many she barely knew, approached her to offer words of support and admiration. In their eyes, Clara wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a symbol of grace under pressure, someone who had stood up for herself with dignity and compassion. Clara found herself overwhelmed by the outpouring of kindness. Everywhere she went, people stopped to thank her for how she had handled the situation. They praised her for taking the high road, for refusing to stoop to Dr. Mitchell's level, and for embodying the values that Brookfield held dear. She had always been well-liked, but now she was something more, a community hero. At the hospital, Clara's standing among the staff reached new heights. The nurses, many of whom had been quietly enduring Dr. Mitchell's arrogance, looked up to her even more. Her decision to show compassion rather than revenge had earned their deepest respect. Even the doctors, who had initially stayed out of the conflict, began to recognize Clara's strength and leadership. But the most surprising development came from Mr. Carter himself. A week after the showdown, Clara received a call from his office. He wanted to meet with her privately to discuss an opportunity. Unsure of what to expect, Clara agreed and found herself seated across from Mr. Carter in his office, which was filled with old books, family portraits, and a sense of quiet authority. "Clara," Mr. Carter began, "I've watched you over the years, and I've always known that you were a person of great character. But what you did in that boardroom, choosing grace over revenge, showed me that you are also a leader." Clara blushed, feeling out of place in such a formal setting. "I was just trying to do what felt right." "That's exactly why I've called you here," Mr. Carter said, leaning forward. "I believe you have more to offer this community than just your work at the hospital. I'm starting a new community health initiative aimed at improving access to health care for underprivileged families in Brookfield, and I want you to lead it." Clara was stunned. The offer was unexpected, and the responsibility immense. "Lead it? Mr. Carter, I'm just a nurse. I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that." "Nonsense," Mr. Carter said, smiling for the first time. "You have everything you need to succeed. You understand people, you care deeply about this community, and most importantly, you lead by example. Those are the qualities we need." Clara hesitated for a moment, the weight of the offer settling on her shoulders. But deep down, she knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make a difference beyond the walls of the hospital. "I'm honored, Mr. Carter," she said finally. "I'll do my best." Just when it seemed like everything had fallen into place for Clara, an unexpected twist threw everything into question. As she began her work on the Community Health Initiative, Clara started spending more time at the hospital's administrative offices, where she had access to reports and financial documents she had never seen before. It was during one of these late-night sessions, poring over budgets and funding allocations, that she stumbled upon something troubling. In a folder marked "Confidential," Clara found documents detailing severe funding cuts to the hospital's charity programs, cuts that directly affected the very families the new initiative was supposed to help. What was even more shocking was that these cuts had been authorized by Mr. Carter himself. At first, Clara couldn't believe it. Mr. Carter, the man who had publicly stood up for her, who had offered her the chance to lead this initiative, was he behind these decisions? The more she read, the more it became clear that Mr. Carter's influence over the hospital went far deeper than she had realized. He had been quietly diverting funds from certain programs for years, using his power to manipulate the hospital's budget in ways that benefited his own interests, while still maintaining his public image as the town's benevolent benefactor. Clara's heart raced as she pieced together the evidence. It became clear that Mr. Carter's public defense of her and his offer to lead the initiative were part of a larger strategy. By putting her in a leadership position, He had effectively silenced any potential criticism she might have raised about the hospital's finances. She had unknowingly become a pawn in his larger game. For days, Clara wrestled with the truth. She had always seen Mr. Carter as a man of integrity, someone who quietly supported the town without seeking recognition. But now she wasn't sure who he really was. She faced an agonizing decision. Should she confront Mr. Carter and risk everything she had worked for? Or should she stay quiet, knowing that exposing him could destroy not only his reputation, but also the very initiative she had been entrusted to lead? The weight of the conspiracy bore down on Clara, and the decision before her seemed impossible. On one hand, she had been given the chance to lead a program that could change lives in Brookfield. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the corruption she had uncovered. If she exposed Mr. Carter's actions, it could jeopardize everything: the initiative, the hospital's funding, and the town's trust in its most influential figure. As she stood in the hospital's quiet hallway late one evening, staring at the documents in her hand, Clara realized that the choice she made now would define her legacy in Brookfield. Would she be the person who turned a blind eye to corruption in order to protect her own career? Or would she stand up for what was right, even if it meant bringing down a man who had once defended her? The decision weighed heavily on her heart, and she knew that whatever path she chose, there would be no turning back. In the weeks following the revelation of the hospital's corruption, Clara found herself at a crossroads that would define the rest of her life. She had always been known as a humble, compassionate nurse, someone who put her patients and community first. But the events that had unfolded since Dr. Mitchell's public humiliation, Mr. Carter's secretive actions, and the discovery of the financial misconduct had forced Clara to reassess not only her role in the hospital, but also her responsibility to the town. The Clara who had once kept her head down and quietly endured injustice was gone. In her place stood a woman who had been pushed to the edge and come out stronger, more decisive, and willing to take risks. She had learned that compassion alone wasn't always enough. Sometimes you had to fight for what was right, even when the cost was high. Clara reflected on how far she had come. The journey from being a nurse who cared for her patients one-on-one to becoming a community leader, faced with decisions that affected the entire town, had been unexpected. But she had grown into it, learning to balance her empathy with the courage to confront power. In many ways, this transformation was not just about standing up to Dr. Mitchell or uncovering Mr. Carter's corruption. It was about finding her voice. The experience had made Clara realize that leadership came with moral responsibilities, and that being silent in the face of wrongdoing was a form of complicity. She could no longer just be a healer in the hospital. She had to be a protector of the integrity of the community. But the weight of that responsibility was heavy, and the decision she had to make now would change everything. As the whispers of corruption spread through Brookfield, the town's reaction was divided. On one hand, Clara had become a beacon of hope and strength for many. People admired her bravery, not only for standing up to Dr. Mitchell, but also for taking a principled stand against the institution that many in the town had always revered. Her rise from a quiet, dedicated nurse to a community leader gave many people a sense of empowerment. It was as if Clara's decision had given them permission to question the status quo, to look beyond the surface and ask hard questions about the power structures in Brookfield. But not everyone felt the same way. Some of the more powerful members of the community, many of whom had long benefited from Mr. Carter's influence, were hesitant to fully support Clara's cause. To them, Mr. Carter had been a quiet benefactor, someone who had used his wealth and connections to build Brookfield's infrastructure. The hospital, the parks, the library, these were all legacies of the Carter family. The idea that he could be involved in corruption or misuse of funds was hard for them to accept. At local businesses and in town meetings, conversations revealed deeper issues of class and power dynamics. For the first time in years, people began to question whether the town's wealthier figures, those who had always operated behind the scenes, were truly acting in the community's best interest. It wasn't just about Mr. Carter. It was about the entire system of quiet influence that had shaped Brookfield for decades. Yet, despite the division, there was a growing consensus that something needed to change. Clara had sparked a conversation that had long been overdue, and the town was now grappling with the implications of what she had uncovered. But for Clara, the most pressing issue was not the town's reaction. It was the moral dilemma she faced in her own heart. She sat late at night in her small home, staring at the documents she had uncovered, her thoughts swirling with conflicting emotions. If she exposed the corruption, she knew it would devastate Mr. Carter's reputation and potentially harm the hospital she had worked so hard to support. Mercy Hill was more than just a building. It was a lifeline for the town. Many of its programs, even those underfunded due to Mr. Carter's actions, still provided critical services for the community's most vulnerable populations. Bringing the scandal to light could mean losing funding or damaging the hospital's reputation beyond repair. On the other hand, Clara couldn't turn a blind eye to the injustice she had uncovered. The misuse of funds wasn't just a financial issue. It was a betrayal of the trust that the town had placed in its leaders. The families who relied on charity programs, the patients who came to the hospital for care, and the employees who worked there deserved better. Could she really stay silent, knowing what she knew? And if she did, would she be any better than those who had allowed the corruption to thrive in the first place? Clara knew that the decision wasn't just about Mr. Carter or the hospital. It was about what kind of person she wanted to be. Would she be someone who protected the status quo for the sake of convenience, or would she be the person who dared to speak up, even if it meant shaking the foundations of the very community she loved? In the end, Clara made her choice. The next morning, she called a press conference. The small meeting room at the town hall was packed with journalists, hospital staff, and concerned citizens. Clara stood at the podium, her hand steady, her heart resolute. She began by thanking the community for their support and for trusting her throughout the difficult journey she had been on. Then, with a deep breath, Clara revealed everything. She spoke of the corruption she had uncovered, the misuse of hospital funds, and the deep-rooted connections that had allowed the injustice to persist for so long. She didn't spare any details. As she spoke, gasps filled the room. And by the time she finished, the weight of the truth hung heavy in the air. Clara knew the consequences would be severe. Mr. Carter's reputation was destroyed, and his once quiet influence over the town was shattered. The hospital's board immediately launched a full investigation into the funding cuts, and the future of Mercy Hill became uncertain. For Clara, the personal cost was also steep. She had lost the trust of some who believed she had gone too far. And the new community health initiative, which she had been so excited to lead, was put on hold indefinitely. But Clara stood by her decision. She had chosen to stand up for the truth, even when it wasn't easy, even when it meant risking everything she had worked for. And in doing so, she had sparked a movement in Brookfield. People began questioning the systems of power, demanding transparency, and pushing for changes that had been long overdue. As Clara walked out of the press conference, the weight of what she had done settled over her. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that she had done the right thing. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. But as the town of Brookfield grappled with the fallout, one question lingered in the minds of everyone who had heard Clara's story. Was she right to expose the truth, no matter the cost? Or should she have protected the community she loved, even if it meant staying silent? The question, as much a moral dilemma for the town as it was for Clara, hung in the air, inviting reflection and debate. And as people gathered in small groups to discuss what had happened, they couldn't help but wonder, what would they have done in her place?